My name is Claire Bian, and I'm president of ISPS-US and a voice here. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to facilitate the webinar and to introduce Ron Unger. Ron's a therapist and an educator specializing in psychological approaches for helping people with the experiences commonly called psychosis. And he is especially interested in the intersection of trauma, psychosis, and spirituality. His work is informed by his own personal experience of those intersections. And Ron chairs the Education Committee of ISPS-US. I'd also like to welcome Patrick Galasso, a certified ASL interpreter who will be signing for us during this webinar.
I want to say a little bit more about myself. As Claire indicated, I've had my own experiences of extreme states of mind as a young person. And I sat and did things that could have gotten me diagnosed, that I never did get dragged into the system. But these experiences happened in what was overall a positive period of my life, a time of exploration and discovery. Then I became to some degree a mad activist, writing, speaking, and protesting with the group that eventually became Mind Freedom. But then I realized that we were spending a lot of time telling the system, hey, you guys should have alternatives, but people in the system didn't even seem to know how to approach things alternatively. So I decided to become a therapist and somebody who was providing an alternative approach, and also to teach others how to do that. So I now work meeting with and trying to be helpful to people who are struggling with mental and emotional challenges, or especially what the system calls psychosis, or what others might call extreme states or madness. Now, one thing you might notice if you do this kind of work is a tremendous diversity of what might be called mad experiences and perspectives, and also what you might think of as the extreme contradictions, including contradictions between what seems helpful to some versus others might say that's harmful to do that, or what might seem helpful at one time versus another time. And I think if we want practical ways of helping people, we need good ways to talk about and negotiate these contradictions, such as, for example, the contradictions between, say, mad pride perspectives, where the person values their mad perspective and doesn't want to lose their madness, and then recovery perspectives, where somebody maybe totally wants to leave madness behind, just as they might want to recover from a bad accident or from the flu. What I want to talk about is how to possibly manage such contradictions without asserting that one point of view or the other is completely correct. In fact, it's really hard to be completely correct when you talk about these topics. I even sometimes refer to a Zen saying, and the Zen saying is, open mouth, already a mistake. As you try to say something and put it into words, you probably already get it wrong in some sense. But I also like, an approach where you actually become really aware that there's multiple possible meanings to about any statement. And so I like this statement from the Discordians, where they say all statements are true in some sense, false in some sense, meaningless in some sense, and then they go on, true and false in some sense, blah, blah, blah. Now, the Discordians worship chaos and try to have fun doing that. But while their perspective is a bit, some sense silly, some sense mad, their willingness to look at contradictory meanings is, I think, really helpful and really kind of essential. Now, I am giving this talk because I think mad pride and disability pride are really, really important things. But I also find value in looking at the way those concepts don't make sense. So I'm going to start by looking at some of the problems with those concepts. So for example, it's been said that disability pride represents rejection of the notion that our physical, sensory, mental, and cognitive differences from the non-disabled standard are wrong or bad in any way. So one question might be, can anybody see anything that's maybe a problematic with that assertion, or that you'd find it'd be impossible to agree with? Trying to make it so I can see the chat. Yeah. Anybody see anything that would be a problem with that statement, that rejecting that any physical, sensory, mental, or cognitive difference from the non-disabled standard are wrong or bad in any way? Okay, so it says, what about if somebody murders somebody? And you say it's not bad based on their state of mind. Oh, I was thinking that person was evil, so I killed them. Or it forecloses grief that people can experience through loss of ability and also the struggles of chronic pain. Maybe it doesn't allow for necessary accommodations, or that the differences can still cause problems. Yeah, so it's so those are important things, I think. In order to assert that there's no way that anything could be wrong or bad about any sensory, mental, or cognitive difference, you kind of really need to assert there's no such thing as a mistake, because mistakes, after all, are just a different way of seeing or thinking about something, right? And then it also follows that we can't blame anyone for treating us badly, because after all, they're just acting on the way they look at things and what they believe about things, right? And you know, we can't say that if they can't say we're bad, we can't say they're bad either. So my sense is, my position is not just that this radical stance is completely untrue, because I think there's something to it, but I think we should also be aware of the way it doesn't make sense. And that's one of the tricks I'm hoping people pick up on this, is just looking at things in all different kinds of ways. So another problem with the concept of disability pride follows from the common definition of pride, because according to most definitions, pride is something we experience relative to ability and achievement. And so that's kind of like the opposite of disability or inability to do something. So if you're proud of something, you typically want more of it, right? I mean, people will work for years or a lifetime to gain various kinds of abilities, but would it really make sense for somebody to do something that would increase a disability? So anyway, there's some problems with disability pride. I mean, like more specifically at mad pride issues. You know, I think it's true to say that from the perspective of the general public, the concept, I'm already been through that one, sorry. I think it's true from the perspective of the general public, the concept of madness is usually one explanation for why people act in a way that's believed to be wrong. Because people have expectations of how people should act, and then when they don't live up to those expectations, they have to explain it. So one is that maybe the person is bad, they just don't want to act right. And another is that, well, maybe they're mad, they're lost somehow, and they don't know why or how to act right. And then a third might be they just don't have the capacity for some reason to do what we think they should do. So if I say, let's say I'm mad, but it's fine with me and I don't, you know, even want to change what I can, but then it's wrong for others if they push me to change, so they should stop doing that. I'm really saying that I shouldn't have to try to change to meet others' expectations, but others should change to try to meet my expectations. Again, there's a contradiction in that. But let me take another perspective on that. So, because so far I'm saying maybe looking at the problems with thinking that everybody's okay just as they are. But it's also interesting to look at perspectives that say that maybe everything is okay just how it is. You know, like what if we really sat a little longer with that position, that maybe there isn't such a thing as a mistake? You know, like what if, you know, no matter what we do, everything somehow ends up the same anyway? You know, like you can look at this from different perspectives, like, you know, aren't we all going to end up dead no matter what we do? Or if it's really true that we're one with the universe, isn't the universe going to go on and have its liveliness forever, regardless of what we do. So there was a period in my life where I was really questioning the meaning of everything. And one thing I questioned was this idea that anything could be better than anything else. You know, we might think or feel that something's better than something else, but what if that's just an illusion, just an attachment to something? Oh, I get attached to wanting it this way, when really it's not necessarily any better than anything else. Now, one of the curious things was at that time, I actually thought I was superior to everyone else because I recognized that nothing could be better than anything else, which of course there was a big contradiction in that. To be consistent, I would have to have recognized that if nothing can be better than anything else, then you really can't be better by recognizing the truth of that. So anyway, this notion that nothing can be a mistake relates to this state of mind that's been called radical acceptance, where you just completely accept everything just as exactly as it is. That was actually brought to Western psychology by Marsha Linehan, who was a psychiatric survivor, even though she hid that for years. I gave this kind of talk once before, and Emily Cutler, who's organized a MAD Studies webinar series for MAD in America, she critiqued the emphasis on acceptance in the modern mental health treatment because she didn't like the notion that people that had diagnoses should change to become more accepting, while there was not an equivalent sense that the world should change to become more accepting of people, including MAD people. And I think that's a really important point. But I think there's also a sense where one can accept everything about oneself, including, you know, like if I'm really going to fully accept myself, I might find, well, there's parts of me that are actually furious with the world for things that it does and ways it causes pain and suffering. So I can actually have kind of like one foot in radical acceptance, that maybe everything is perfectly fine the way it is, and then another foot in, and maybe the part of me that wants to fight for social justice is a perfectly fine part, and I can organize around that. It's kind of paradoxical, but I think it's actually kind of functional. It's maybe a little hard to wrap your head around, but hopefully I'll make some sense of that kind of thing. So this idea that maybe nothing's necessarily better than anything else, and that maybe our judgment actually causes us problems. It's kind of interesting that you can find that idea even in really ancient ideas. Like if you look, for example, at the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible, what did they get in trouble for? They ate from the tree that gave them knowledge of good and evil. Well, what is knowledge and good and evil? It's the idea that one thing is good and one thing is not. So there's that kind of idea that judgment causes problems. And then I want to show just a really short video that illustrates another version of that problem with judgment. And this one is told. The story is told by Alan Watts, but it's a Chinese story. So let me just play that very briefly.
Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer who lost a horse, ran away. And all the neighbors came round that evening and said, "That's too bad." And he said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse came back and brought 7 wild horses with it. And all the neighbors came around and said, "Why, that's great, isn't it?" And he said, "Maybe." The next day, his son was attempting to tame one of these horses and was riding it and was thrown and broke his leg. And all the neighbors came round in the evening and said, "Well, that's too bad, isn't it?" And the farmer said, "Maybe." And the next day, the conscription officers came around looking for people for the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. And all the neighbors came round that evening and said, "Isn't that wonderful?" And he said, "Maybe." the whole process of nature is an integrated process of immense complexity, and it is really impossible to tell whether anything that happens in it is good or bad, because you never know what will be the consequences of a misfortune, or you never know what will be the consequences of good fortune.
All right. So anyway, I mean, it's interesting. Like, if you can't really know, what's ultimately going to be good or bad. So when we're, there's a lot to that, but it relates to the thing, like, how do we know what to be proud of if we don't know what's ultimately good? And I also think that kind of relates to there's a notion, and that goes way back, that pride maybe is a sin, or pride is a mistake, or pride goeth before a fall. And if you don't know what to be proud about, you could, in some sense, be equally proud of everything and everybody, since you don't have a reason to prefer one over the other, or just as proud of all your ideas. But then how do you decide actually what to do? See, one thing about life is that to somehow live our life, we have to choose one thing over another. For movement, we have to make choices. So we somehow need ideas about what's better and worse, but at the same time, having ideas like that can get us into all kinds of trouble. That's a real basic paradox. So then you say, who or what confirms choices as worthy or worth being proud of? And that's where I think it gets kind of political. Like, should we just say that any choice anyone makes is as good as somebody else's? But then what do we do when somebody else's choices interfere with my choices? Do I just say that that's okay, or do I fight back and then maybe interfere with the choices others are making, trying to impact me? Often we end up with kind of social contract between what kind of choices people should be able to make freely versus when they should defer to the rights of others or consider the needs of the group. And then there's also politics that happen within a person. Now, there's a woman I co-facilitate a Hearing Voices group with, and she recently spoke eloquently in the group about how she wants to be in charge of deciding what in her extreme state experience is a gift and something to be proud of, and what is maybe a symptom or a problem or something to work on changing. And I'm pretty sympathetic with that, her wanting to choose for herself. But it does get complex, because people, for example, don't even often have agreement inside themselves. We sometimes value and do things which later, or maybe even while we're doing them, feel really bad to other parts of ourselves. And here's an example of some of the complexities. Let's say I'm talking to someone who says that, well, tonight I'm going to go shoot myself, and I'm proud of having the courage to just end this stupid, meaningless existence. And if I take the position, well, he's got the right to choose for himself, and who am I to disagree? And then let's say he goes home and he shoots himself in the head, but he actually survives. And I actually met somebody once who did that. They had shot themselves in the head and survived. And then he comes to me and says, what were you thinking? I was, telling you I was suicidal, and you just told me it was okay. If you had done something, I wouldn't have had this terrible brain injury. So again, but if you've been around the human rights and mental health movement a lot, often when professionals intervene, they cause more harm than good. But I think professionals also worry about, what if we do harm by not intervening? It gets, again, very tricky. And it's just this big political thing, like, who gets to decide, who has the answer. Unfortunately, you're not going to get the answer in this webinar. What I'm going to propose is that we just kind of have to stay uncertain. It's most practical to keep it an open question. So I like this quote from Emerson, where people wish to be settled, but only as far as they are unsettled is there any hope for them. And I think this staying unsettled is also like key to the open dialogue approach, in which they say, they want to be looking at things from different points of view, and they think they're really stuck if they're only looking at things from one point of view. And they understand that when you have to make decisions, you have to settle on something. But in between, it's really important to be looking at things and letting all the voices be heard, to try to pick our ways through this difficult stuff. So what this diagram here does is it kind of illustrates how we can both value sanity and value madness, even though in some sense they're opposite of each other. So there's times that we're having problems with our our MAD experience, and so we really want to work on recovery. I want to achieve some sanity. I want to get back to looking at things the way other people do and processing things the way they do. But one thing is sanity is really doesn't often have the answers to everything in our life. There's problems that don't have an answer within sanity. And so because those problems tend to build up, then there's actually some value in going outside of sanity. And everything outside of sanity might be called madness, right? So we recover from sanity and go back into madness, go back into being beyond sanity. But that in itself can cause problems. And so those problems build up. And so then we might need to work on recovering our sanity again. Now, if we look at things this way, it really allows us to see that both have value, that one might have more value at a given time. And it's not all about, sanity being this always higher state. Sometimes sanity is what we need to work towards, but sometimes it isn't. It was, Robin Williams who said, "You're only given a little spark of madness. You mustn't lose it." But I think actually it is common that we lose it. We lose our spark, we lose our divine inspiration and trying to fit into the normal. But then I think it's also important that we have to go back and find it sometimes, and we have to, go mad in some kind of way. Now, hopefully we find a way to do that without going too far into madness, or being able to come back to sanity when we need to. So that's all, finding some discernment about all that is really important. I think what I'm, I don't typically identify as like, oh, I'm a mad person, though I'm a person who values madness as part of me, is the way I typically do it or think of it, because I see some value in the mad part of things and some value in the sane part of things. I would say it's important not to overvalue madness. But I think a big problem in our current mental health system is the overvaluing of sanity and stability. In this slide, I call stability the false god of the mental health system. And that's not to say that I think instability would be a better god. I think we're better off valuing both, which fits in with what we know from the science of complex systems, that life happens somewhere between order and chaos, between stability and instability. So maybe we could also say between sanity and madness. Sometimes we have more of one or more of the other, but we really need to have both in some ways in our life. That touches on this slide, like how are disturbing emotions and madness like a potato? Interestingly, being mad in English is now more commonly used to refer to being angry. But really all disturbing emotions can be understood as a bit of madness. Now, it doesn't work in our life to just let them take over, the disturbing emotions take over, but seeing them as pathology can also be really harmful. There's a saying about feelings that I often repeat to people, but I think it applies to madness in general. And the statement is that feelings are like children. It doesn't work to let them drive the car, but it also doesn't work to lock them in the trunk. And the way that relates to the potato, to get back to the potato, is that it was Thich Nhat Hanh who said that having mad or angry feelings or having other disturbing emotions is like having a potato. If the potato is raw, it has very little of any value to us, and actually can be harmful if we eat a bunch of raw potato. But if we hang out with it, get to know it, cook it, we can draw out what's of value in it, and then it can be of real value in our life. And so then it becomes something that we can be proud of when we've kind of like wrestled with it and found what is of value of it. And so I think the same is true of madness. Another way of looking at this is this importance of valuing both sanity and madness is portrayed in this diagram by Isabel Clarke and her colleagues. And they're pointing out that the experience of madness, or having non-shared reality, other ways of looking at things, is really something we're meant to have, but we're also meant to have some kind of understanding of ordinary thinking, shared reality. And it's when we're in touch with both that we do best, because that's when, sometimes we need to look within our non-shared reality and find things that are left out of sanity, and those things are important. And other times we need to really not get lost in what's inside us and tune into what's outside in order to do better. And I'm not, of course, going to try to tell you exactly when you need to do which, but it's just having that sense that, hey, there's a value to both sides. And we don't want to have too much pride in either side. We don't want to have too much pride in our sanity. And we don't, because as David Oak says, that normal people are destroying the planet. What we think of as sanity is not completely sane. So anyway, I think this slide also relates to the question of whether shamans or people who go into really altered states as part of a creative or spiritual process are mad. Now, many of you have probably seen the film Crazy Wise, which explores the way in many indigenous cultures, young people who spontaneously go into altered states are then trained to go into such trance states in a way that benefit others. Now, when they go into those states, in some sense, you could still frame it as maybe madness, because those are the states that other people get lost in. But the difference is that the shamans and others that have become successfully creative have found a way to go in those states and not get lost. It's like the difference between somebody that goes into wilderness and needs rescued and somebody that goes in the wilderness and knows where they're going and has a fine adventure. So again, it's like that bringing more discernment, then that allows you to really be more proud of experiences that are outside of the mainstream. So what I'd like to do now is compare and contrast a number of different possible sources of mad pride, because people understand mad pride pretty, they have varying understandings, and they all have some degree of worth or value. Depends to a particular individual at a particular time. So one of the ways of understanding mad pride is just saying, hey, other people see what I'm going through as bad, but it's actually something good. It's actually a positive thing. It's not disabling or harmful at all. And in some cases that might actually be true. And in some cases it actually might be harmful to the person, that they're not seeing the problem with their own state, that maybe it's not entirely helpful to them. But another meaning of mad pride is being proud of something which might be hurtful or disabling in some sense, but which is also helpful or a gift in some other sense. So, an example might be a person who's been, they were traumatized as a kid, then they pushed it all away. They seemed to become an apparent success, and then all that stuff kind of welled back up. Now, in some ways that may be very disabling to them, but on the other hand, it may be actually great that they're finally turning and facing what happened to them when they were a kid, even though it's really disabling for a period of time. But they can be proud that they're actually going on that journey. And then, or it could be something that actually is, it really is just overall detrimental, but it leads to some other experiences and connections that are a gift. And so like, you know, that, for example, relates to a lot of what people have found in disability pride. So somebody might be, let's say, you know, they're deaf and they can't hear, that's a disability, but on the other hand, that allows them to become part of the deaf community, and they have really rich experiences in that, and they, you know, learn all sorts of things they never would have learned if they weren't deaf, and they're really proud of all those things. Now, also, you can have pride around something that is, you know, you see as really detrimental, but your pride is in the strength and skill that you develop in responding to the challenge it presents. Like I know one guy who hears voices and he has no pride at all in his voices, even though some people do. He has no pride in that, but he has pride in his strength that he's developed to face the voices. So again, people are entitled to, you know, the kind of pride that works for them. Yeah, I mentioned David Oakes. You know, he was the former director of Mind Freedom, and he really he likes now being called a psycho quad because he unfortunately had an accident where he fell and broke his neck, and so he's now quadriplegic, and he's also a mad activist from way back. But you know, he's very interested in making connections between mad pride and the physical disability world. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of like mention him. You know, I think he's made a great adaptation to that, and is very proud of his like he's both fought to get back some functioning by like doing a lot of physical therapy so that he can move his arms at least to the extent he can, but then also just accepting that there's some value in him just having a different kind of experience than other people do, which gives him a unique perspective on the world. He can have pride in that too. So he can just be proud of being who he is. I think what I'd like to do now is dig a little deeper into the meaning of mental disturbances specifically. You know, I think there's a tendency in our society and the mental health system to pathologize that which disturbs us. So again, that's whether it's a disturbing emotional state, some anxiety, some grief or whatever, or voices that come in and disturb us. Or sometimes there's just an overwhelming upheaval in our mind, which really goes beyond comprehension. And so the focus is always put on just suppressing the disturbance, usually with drugs, but also with various kinds of persuasion or coercion. And that's true, even though we've known for a long time, as many therapists say, you know, what you resist persists, or what you try to suppress goes down to the basement and lifts weights. Therapists have saying like that because they're aware of how that works. Now, we could just try to turn that on its head and celebrate that which disturbs us. And then, though, we might be accused of romanticizing madness, and I don't think that's really the answer either. I think it's more complex and nuanced. Now, when we look at bigger social systems, it's clear that disturbances can be both good or bad, or sometimes have a mixture of both. And so I like the metaphor of revolutions, which obviously can be a severe disturbance. You know, they clearly can have very diverse outcomes. You know, some revolutions end up making changes that become a real source of pride, like 4th of July, and we celebrate in the US, yay, revolution. And that's the more romantic or positive side of revolution. But then you also see countries having revolutions that lead to massive and horrific disasters that may be gone for years or decades, failed states. So anyway, it's very common for governments to see suppression of revolution as the solution for anything that is at all revolutionary, but that can really backfire. And it was John F. Kennedy who said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." So lots of people have noticed when they just try to resist something disturbing inside themselves, they set off basically an internal civil war. Eleanor Longden is a person who's spoken eloquently, for example, about the way psychiatry taught her to try to focus on just trying to suppress just one slightly disturbing voice she heard. And pretty soon she had a war going with 12 loud, vicious voices. Now, it can also fail when we just try to appease that which is disturbing. So Eleanor Longden tried that too. You know, she tried just listening to the voice and doing whatever it said. Sometimes it led to some funny things, like when it told her to take a glass of water and pour it over her professor's head, which she can laugh about now. I think it got her in trouble. But it also led her to do a lot of pretty miserable self-harm when she was just doing whatever the voice said. So what does work, both for revolutions in countries and disturbances in the mind? Well, I think it's a combination of being open to negotiation and being influenced by what's trying to disturb us, and setting limits and refusing to go too far. Like, hey, we'll do this for you, but we won't do that. So it's something that has to be worked out. So like if a government has too much pride in itself, it will refuse to bend, it will refuse to listen. Hey, maybe what we're doing isn't working for everybody. And then it might try to brutally suppress the opposition or drive it to violence. While a government that bends too easily will just get pushed around by forces that might then take over and become oppressive themselves. So I think it's the same for revolutions in the mind, otherwise known as madness. So there's can be a lot that's good in revolutions in the mind, but we also have to be cautious about being, too sure that it's all a good thing, because it can also lead to real problems. Like in the Who song, here's a new boss, same as the old boss, or repeating just more, maybe not getting anywhere. But if we stay more in that place of uncertainty and negotiation and hearing different voices and trying to work it out, then I think we can actually move in a good direction. Another metaphor for understanding madness is that of fire. Often I think we want just a bit of madness around, like when you have a fire in the fireplace. It's a very contained bit of madness, but there's also times when it can be useful to have fire take a much bigger role, like when here in the Western states in the US, for example, we're gradually learning that letting our forests burn regularly in a modest way is actually a way of avoiding having too much debris build up, which can lead to more catastrophic fires later. So sometimes allowing a certain amount of fire or a certain amount of revolution keeps us from the catastrophic ones later. So this whole thing about revolution and madness and pride brings up another issue that I want to touch on. And what's the relationship between trauma and mad pride? And so we might ask ourselves the question, if madness, for example, results from damage due to trauma, why would we be proud of it? I think in seeking an answer to that, it's important to look at how madness can be not just something bad that happens to us after trauma, but more often madness involves an attempt to heal the trauma or to correct things. Though it can also get off track and cause more problems, just like revolution can. I mean, that was kind of like my experience, where I was traumatized as a kid and developed this really sense of myself as this defective person. And then the revolution was when I tried to throw off all the ways I'd looked at myself and become a completely new person and see the world completely different, and eventually start feeling like I'm God and can recreate the universe. But there was an attempt to revolt against the patterns I'd been stuck in. And so that can be an important part of madness. And when people experience horrible things in psychosis, that can also be an attempt to heal. for one thing, it can be a way of trying to grapple with the horror of things that happened earlier that were never digested. And so there can be something positive in that. But a key thing is that if people get the right kind of help or the right kind of luck or a mix, I think definitely that's what happened with me. I never really got professional help, but from books and friends and peers and all that, I got the kind of help I needed. But anyway, after going through a period of revolutionary disturbance, the person may discover a new balance, a new vision of how to live that can be experienced as very valuable. And so that's why some people have called the whole process of going mad can be the renewal process. And so this process has been divided into 3 basic stages. In stage 1, there's some kind of a problem that can't be solved within our conventional ways of thinking, within the constructs that exist in our mind, within our version of sanity. And so that's where the revolution happens, or temporarily our constructs are shut down. We start processing things outside of our normal constructs. And that's when we're way out there in what some people think of it as madness, so it's also the state that Joseph Campbell talked about when he said that mystics swim with delight in the same sea that psychotics drown, or something like that, something to that effect. Because, but it's actually not true that everyone goes. Often people go out there and they're just confused and floundering, but they actually find a way to draw on something that then allows them to put themselves back together in a new way. And that's stage 3. And of course, whether that's done successfully or not often depends a lot on whether people get the kind of support they need, whether they can do it under a state of low enough stress that they can keep moving things around until they kind of get it right and it feels good for at least a while. Now, in indigenous cultures, it was often understood that when individuals went through this kind of process, they would often come up with something that would enrich the whole community. So they would deliberately encourage altered states through the use of things like trance induction and ceremony, or isolation and vision quests and fasting, sometimes psychedelic drugs. Now, this was all understood to be dangerous, but it was a risk worth taking so that the group would have access to healing and new perspectives and general renewal. And of course, they also worked out ways of reducing the risk by having, really good community support, and then when people seemed prone to those kind of altered states, they kind of educated them on how to navigate them, and that's the kind of stuff that obviously I think we could use a lot more of. So as far as like where to go with all this, it's to recognize that there can be a lot of value in this process of going mad, assuming we can work through it in a good way. And some of the ways, like learning from shamans, that this ability to travel into an altered state and then come back is really important. Now, a more prosaic version of that is just becoming dialogical, being aware that there's different points of view and being able to explore a point of view, but then being aware, hey, let's hear the other voices too, and let's draw them into relationship with each other. And that skill of being able to relate to different voices and help them work it out peacefully is really just the key to what's called dialogical practice. And or there's just different kinds of collaborative exploration. Like, I teach about CBT for psychosis, and when that's done well, it's a collaborative exploration. The therapist doesn't insist they have the answers. They're just like, hey, let's explore together what's going on and what might work for you, and what the advantages and disadvantages are of looking at things in different ways, and that kind of stuff. And it's open to the idea that there's something of value within this psychosis, as well as looking at, hey, what are the potential problems you're running into here? How do we what are some different ways we might try to avoid those problems? You know, really what we need is a mental health system where these kind of things are routinely practiced. These kind of skills are part of what people know. We also kind of like need some safe containers for people to explore MAD states of mind. And there's different ways that might happen. I mentioned, I mean, there's been, you know, some, you know, madness sanctuaries were created in the past, like places where people could just go and live and explore altered states of mind. Now those are pretty hard to organize. But then there's a lot of other variations that can work when you don't have access to those. John Blackwell has done some interesting stuff where he's created retreats where people have the intention of exploring extreme states. So maybe people that had previously been hospitalized, but now they want to go back and kind of explore what was of value in that, in my altered states. They could use special breathing and supported environment and explore things. There's an ISPS webinar that's on YouTube that you can look up about that if you're curious. But open dialogue helps people explore different points of view. Any kind of good therapy, especially therapy where the therapist is open to exploring the possible positive side of what seems to be madness. There's spiritual traditions that support spiritual emergence. A lot of different kinds of expressive methods. People like writing is often, like when I was out there, just exploring things in writing really allowed me to work stuff out in a safer kind of way, or, you know, art kinds of stuff, performance. It's an interesting thing with performance. If you can get an audience, like for example, you know, I wanted to believe I was a prophet that could change the world or something like that. But you know, one thing about people that are called mad, they're often prophets that don't have any followers. So I kind of realized, hey, I need followers. And one thing about trying to have followers is you often have to adapt your message to make it a little more sane so that it appeals to the followers. But it's also nice to find people that are willing to go into kind of wild places with you. And that's one of the things that happened in my journey. This image on here is of the book cover of a book that my friend John Law is a co-author of, Tales of the San Francisco Cacophony Society, and then it says at the bottom, spawn of the Suicide Club. Well, the Suicide Club was a group of kind of weirdos and urban adventurers that in the late 70s, when I happened to move to San Francisco at 19 years old, who we were just creating our own little weird realities and doing strange things. My friend John Law had just gotten out of a psych hospital, and I had not gotten into the psych hospital, though a lot of people told me that I seemed pretty psychotic. But anyway, we were both interested in kind of like connecting our altered states with other people, and actually finding that there were ways that people were interested in altered ways of looking at things and living and doing things. It made me sort of adapt what I was saying and doing, so I made more sense to others, so I could have followers. But also I appreciated the flexibility of other people being able to see, hey, maybe there's something of value in the weird stuff that I'm coming up with. So I think a society that can open up more to the value of that there's something in mad altered states, and that there's ways to explore them that aren't destructive can be really helpful. So in summary, I think, what we have in most of our mental health system right now is professionals who are too sure of the value of sanity and stability, and they aren't willing enough to question that. And they're too sure that mad experience is just awful and pathological, and they aren't willing enough to see some value in it. But one way of looking at it is that we have like our little bubble of what we think of as sanity, but then there's really this vast sea of alternative possible meanings to things, even like alternative worlds. And while mad people may get lost in parts of that world sometimes, they also potentially find things. And they could find more if they were taught how to navigate that uncertainty and differences more successfully, which is again what they used to do in indigenous cultures. But psychiatry too often just labels that vast sea of possibilities as illness, kind of like the old maps in Europe that used to say everything around it, there be dragons or whatever. So I think it's better to realize that, hey, actually sometimes a society needs to reach outside of its norms in order to, in order to find the things that are missing, because any version of sanity is always limited in what it has to offer. And often the longer we stick with any version of sanity, we run up against its limitations more and more. And we need to actually nurture the people who look outside of sanity. That there's real value in that, and that's like a really important kind of mad pride, I think. That we and when we're trying to be helpers, it's just being aware that there's multiple sides of things. We can help people look at the positive sides of things, the negative sides of things. We can be unsure what's really going to work out, because as Alan Watts says, there's no way you can really know for sure. We're all trying to guess and figure it out. But by being unsettled and dialogical, we can have real honest relationships with people, and we can really help people live. Because that's what it's all about, is both living ourselves and helping other people really come to life. So I think that's my talk, and now we can maybe move on into the question and answer part.
Great. Thank you, Ron. And thank you, Patrick, for your signing. And thank you to everyone who posed questions. We have a lot of really, really good questions. I'd like to read a couple that were posed at the very end, because it really addresses some of the purposes for your giving this talk. And then I will go back and ask questions that people started posing around, and also great comments around 12:19, right after Ron resumed after having read some of the comments. So one of the questions, let's see, Kathleen Lowenstein asked why you're arguing for a strong argument against, e.g., all disability is positive. One can't make arguments against doing things that could harm someone that's counter to being disability positive in your early discussion of disability pride. And she'd like you to speak more to that, but she adds a bit before you begin to answer the question. In my understanding, mad identity, like gay identity, allows one to claim an identity in opposition to an often traumatizing and inherently pathologizing mental health system. It's not about saying it's all good, but it is about finding a voice and sense of community in opposition to inherently invalidating frameworks. Possibly your negative, this is a question, possibly your negative argument is trying to play devil's advocate for arguments against mad pride.
Well, I think you could, because I'm definitely not trying to argue that mad pride is not good. Obviously, I believe it is. I do think it's more complex than gay pride. I've actually been involved a lot in gay pride because I'm gay. I've been now married for 20 some years, and so I'm very aware of that. But gay pride, you can really more like say, hey, just being gay is just good, period. I have a great lover, and and it's fun, and I don't need any help with it, thanks. But being madness is much more nuanced, because often you do need help, and often you've hurt yourself and messed up your friends, and so it's way more nuanced. it's really hard to just say, oh, this is just a good thing and it's wonderful, and quit saying there's anything wrong with it, because actually the person themselves has to say, hey, there's a lot wrong with it. I need help. But at the same time, I think the importance of escaping the pathologizing is really critical. I really totally agree with that. But I think you need to do it a little bit differently when you're working with something with madness. You can't do it like you can with gay pride and just say, hey, this is just a good thing. You're wrong to say there's something wrong with it. Instead, we have to acknowledge that, hey, this is actually a very complex, many-sided thing. It may have some good sides to it. It may need some terrible sides that you need help with. And that we need to look at it in that way more nuanced way. So that's kind of my answer.
Thank you. And let's see. There were a couple of comments following your comment about having one foot in radical acceptance and one foot in social justice. And I said, I love that. And Anne Reed said, cultivating radical maybe, which poses all sorts of interesting possibilities. And, how one opening possibility and also allowing ones to practice self-care from my perspective. I'll stop. And then Kimberly Barton said, choices are not made in isolation. They are social and interactive. That doesn't mean there's no basis for judgment, but rather, even if we return to the state of Adam and Eve, the basis is social and interactive, involving all of the social pressures and influences. And then she continues, I meant to pose, could we be jumping from the individual to the political without recognizing our social embeddedness?
I mean, I think it is really important to recognize our social embeddedness. I think also sometimes when people are mad, they're trying to escape social embeddedness too. I know for me, that was definitely true. I mean, I grew up embedded in a family and a culture that put me down. I was abused at home. Went to school. I was bullied. And then I started realizing I was gay. And of course, that was really put down at the time in the 70s. And so there was all this. And so I wanted to kind of like disengage in some ways. But then, of course, you can't. That's also really problematic if you totally lose your social connection. We're social beings. So there's a lot of complexities there. There's to what extent do we just adjust to fit in? To what extent do we, as Martin Luther King says, stay maladjusted because there's things we refuse to adjust to. So he talked about creative maladjustment. And those are things, again, we need to sort out in dialogue and maybe that radical maybe that someone mentioned.
Thank you. And Scott Norman asked the question, what if inappropriate behavior is accompanied by debilitating physiological agony?
Yeah, I mean, that touches on two things where the person is really suffering themselves and maybe they're behaving in a way that's harming someone else. And so like what I'm saying is we have to look at both the like, let's just focus on the inappropriate behavior now. So someone may be doing something where they're trying to meet some need of their own, but then they're really harming others. So you often have to tune into, well, what's good about that idea you had to behave that way? Well, it would meet this need inside me. Okay, that does sound like an important need. But then let's also look at the fact that this is causing these problems out here, which and then in that process of dialogue, maybe the person can work out a way of meeting that need they had without causing the harm that they were causing outside. And that's part of that sorting out process that we need to do.
Thank you. And then Ane made a comment because you were introduced as someone who's experienced psychosis. She has as well, and was essentially punished and suppressed for her experiences. And I have found shamanism many years later and become a practitioner. It showed me that my madness was my shamanic calling. also the hero's journey. I'm wondering what you think of this.
Yeah, I mean, that really fits with what I was trying to say about the renewal process. It's very much the hero's journey of, being called to the journey and going out somewhere and then coming back, the return. So I totally identify with that. Yeah, and if people could get that earlier, in John Weir Perry's Diabasis, like when people had their first psychotic break, they would welcome them into this and say, hey, we understand you're on a journey. We're here to help you with it. Let's work through it. And it would be nice if that's what the message people got.
I would like to say that my second extended departure from shared experience of about almost 2.5 years allowed me, by going through it, it allowed me to really become the self I was destined to be before I began withdrawing, and then had several life disruptions. So it was such an important process for me. Lorna asks, I'm really interested in the use of language in different contexts. In Ireland, madness is not correlated with wrongdoing or insanity. It can be used as a slang term. He is mad, meaning vibrant, fun, expressing oneself. We do not correlate it with insanity, but expression of oneself in a non-destructive manner. Does labeling people as mad add a label to one's identity that may do harm or separate from societal norms, in turn adding a burden? The use of language in labeling is something we incorporate into our identity. Great presentation. And I don't know that there's a question in there, but it's such a great comment.
That is, it's really interesting to hear that mad has a real different connotation there. But I think there's often that double-sided nature even to words like, sometimes you even see it with schizophrenia, like I've seen it used in a positive sense. There's a local DJ, I think, who included, I can't remember what name he used, but included, or psychotic, that's psychotic, like, hey, let's go do it. It can sometimes be how people are looking at it, so it can be sometimes used as a pejorative or sometimes actually something positive. And I think that's because people realize the need to break free of the mainstream, but then they're often wary of going too far. And I actually think we need to kind of embrace that sense of duality, that there can be something value in it. But yeah, we do need to be wary of, going, overboard in a way that hurts ourselves or hurts others. But exactly where that line is something that needs to be talked about, and nobody's got the final word on it. There's so many complexities to all this. That's why dialogue is so important, and just talking about it and thinking it through together.
Thank you. And Hannah Owens asks, could you speak to the fine line between pride and anosognosia? Is the latter just pathologized pride?
Yeah, anosognosia, or thinking that you're not ill. I think that's a really complex question. I think if, rather than talk in terms of illness, just talk in terms of whether it's something that's going to work out well or not. So I might have real pride in an idea I have, like, yeah, I'm going to, go put my skis on and ski the Pacific Crest Trail, and it's really going to work. And then somebody else might go, like, you're not aware of how hard that is, and that you're not in good enough shape for it, and you don't have the right equipment. And so the question of whether I'm being too prideful and it's actually getting myself into a huge problem, or whether maybe it's actually something I'm actually am ready to do, and the person that's telling me that I'm not is actually the one that's wrong. I mean, that question is, it's a question, and given the exact situation, the person that's telling me I'm, shouldn't do it may be right, or maybe I'm actually right and I actually am ready to traverse that space successfully. So the key thing is finding a way to traverse these spaces and these mental states, and and just like shamans do, they can go into a very altered state, but then they can come back, and they can come back with something of value for their culture, and that's and for themselves, obviously. And so that's kind of like what we want people to be able to do.
Thanks. Thank you. And I think you answered this question, but Kimberly asks, does it seem fair to say that mad pride is distinct from gay pride? Yes, insofar as LGBTQ are not striving to recover, yes. And then I think this is important, and I'm not certain of the context, but Shelley asks, what is that reframing again? What disturbs us? And then an ellipsis. And I don't remember the context. And Shelley, if you could type at the bottom at the chat, I can come back to that question and go on to the next one. If you can type the context, that would be helpful. There are way more questions than I thought. What do you think of the idea that psychotic experiences themselves are traumatic events, and how does that affect the restructuring process of ongoing psychosis?
Yeah, I think that's it's a really complex question whether psychotic stuff is traumatic. Sometimes the psychosis is an attempt to turn towards a previous trauma, but often, as Eleanor Longden points out, that the person is turning towards it, but at the same time they don't want to see it, and so they're disguising it and turning it into other things. And sometimes psychosis is actually an attempt to protect oneself from trauma. So, like, for example, in my experience, I had a lot of shame, in growing up, and then to try to protect myself from shame, I came up with kind of a grandiose identity, which could be considered psychotic. But so in that sense, it was protective. But then once you create a grandiose identity that other people won't accept, you often get traumatized by the way that people don't accept you. They don't accept that you're recreating the universe as God, or something like that. And so that can become traumatizing, or you get yourself into a situation that's traumatizing, or you alienate everyone from yourself, and that becomes traumatizing. Or also sometimes in people's ambivalence, part of them doesn't want to notice a previous trauma, but another part of them wants to just really beat them over the head with it, so they finally recognize it. And so the mind actually exaggerates and makes things way more horrible than so that psychosis can be very traumatizing, and it can also be protective from trauma, and it can also be a process of working through past traumas. So it's very, very complex.
Thank you. And Polly Sabatier has a comment, a great comment, and then a question. One value we have in civilized non-Indigenous persons is nightly access to our dreams. There we find madness made available to anyone seeking renewal and various ways of understanding daylight life. The similarity of night dreams and day life extreme states is the language of symbol, a language all modern people need to become familiar with. And then the question, could you talk a little about what an inpatient treatment system looks like for severe crisis in a way that values the symbol and experience of madness?
Yeah, I think when I mentioned, madness sanctuaries, that some of them which existed in the United States and actually in the late 70s, like if you went into I ward where Michael Cornwell worked, it was just a ward in a mental hospital where they admitted people with first or second episode psychosis, and they attempted to work without antipsychotic drugs, and they just kind of like, main thing is they were just keep people safe while they were with them in their experience, and had conveyed the idea, hey, you can work through this, we can help you work through this and make sense of it. So just offering that kindness, safety, support, engagement, it can be really, really helpful. Now, adding more of an open, and they also added stuff that now would be more like what we call open dialogue, like, hey, let's have the person's family and important people come in and we'll meet and just talk about what everybody's concerns are and views are and try to understand what this is all about, and often did come up with an understanding of what it's all about. You know, I think like open dialogue people, I don't say, well, we should never use something like antipsychotic drugs, but use them very cautiously and sparingly. Ingo Lambrecht is, he's a psychologist, but he's also someone who was trained as a shaman in South Africa. And he would say, well, the South African shamans working with psychosis, they would use the equivalent of medication sometimes. They had herbs that calmed people down, but they didn't make that the primary focus of what they were doing. And that's what I think we should do. People have to work through for themselves, and they also have to negotiate with others about what is it, what kind of things are acceptable or helpful, what kind of things maybe need to be left behind and the person needs to shift out of in order to be well, in order to live well with others.
Great, thank you. And very quick question. What was the, from Kaleidoscope Facilitator, what was the ISPS webinar just mentioned? Don Blackwell?
Sean Blackwell. Yeah, so just look up the, you know, if you go to YouTube, ISPS-US, we have a whole channel and you'll see one that's by Sean Blackwell, and look at that one.
Thank you. And let's see. Oh, Erin Soros writes that she is interested in consent. What if one person wants to be free to experience their madness outside of carceral psychiatry, but another person is grateful for involuntary treatment, thereby giving a kind of retroactive consent? How do we make decisions about risk and value people's autonomy?
Wow, we could have a long webinar on that one. I don't have the final answer, of course. I think one of the, because obviously you can't, how do you predict what somebody's later going to consent to or not? It's extremely, difficult. I think one of the most important things, I think, is for us to recognize that involuntary treatment is itself extremely risky. Right now, I think that's often not recognized. So if there's just, oh, it's kind of risky to let this person go on their own, so let's hospitalize them against their will. And that decision is made without an awareness of the extreme riskiness of hospitalizing someone, and that you might be traumatizing them, you might be setting them up to be more likely to commit suicide later. So if we truly weighed that risk, we might just jump in when the risk is more extreme, and that at other times we might seek more, voluntary engagement. Because I know there's an important study found when they were comparing involuntary outpatient treatment with just reaching out to people with voluntary options, that it turned out to work just as well to reach out with voluntary options, because you connect with people often enough. So I think anything involuntary should be saved for the most dire situations, but I won't try to tell you exactly where that line should be drawn, because that's quite controversial.
Thank you. And Hal Levine asks, Ron, it may be too ethnocentric to think that this reality is it, in all caps. Could it be that people who have those incredible visions be tuning into other dimensions which we simply are not aware of due to a veil of forgetfulness to be in this world? Is it possible that some people are just in tune with this more?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all sorts of possibilities out there, and these things are, really difficult to, just wrap your mind around all the possibilities. We have a webinar coming up that's going to be on the philosophy of madness with Uder Kusters, and he looks at all sorts of paradoxes and stuff about that and trying to figure out reality and sanity and stuff like that. It should be a lot of fun.
Thank you. And Kimberly Barton asks, could the concept of being a foreigner and recognize a person as being unavoidably foreign be helpful as a context for recovery that is I think the word is distinct from a retreat. I experienced recovery when I was living in a European culture. My level of fluency and understanding of the norms of that culture was limited, and others recognized that limit. I was able to throw off the limits of our norms that were traumatizing. Then we know we can't fit in, and thus we find our own way. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a interesting process. I've heard people describe that before, having where they, you know, and they were seen as insane where they were, but then they moved somewhere really different, and there they were just different, and they were able to, you know, find a way to make peace with people around them and stuff like that, because it wasn't defined so much as you're different and bad and sick. It was just like, oh, you're different. Let's figure this out, how to be together.
Thank you. Let's see. Can radical acceptance include the maybe state? This is Anne Reed again. Great. Non-judgmentally, without avoidance, without clinging, insisting.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to look at it. I mean, I think we can radically accept, but then also like, well, maybe there's things that we don't want to fully accept. So I actually find it really helpful. Well, again, going back to David Oakes, he liked to say when he was working before he had his accident that his goal every day was to go out and change the world and also have a great day. And in order to have a great day, we often have to just accept that things just kind of like are as they are. We can appreciate and enjoy them just as they are. But obviously, to go out and fight for social justice, you have to be, you put down and say, this isn't okay, let's change it, you know. And so finding out just how much of which side to draw from it's an open question, but it definitely speaks to that kind of like maybe, and you know, I don't know. So I don't have an answer, but that's, I'm giving kind of non-answers and suggesting maybe we can just live in those non-answers.
I think that's what we need to do. And let's see, Shelley asks, any advice on helping my 19-year-old son with schizophrenia recognize his greatness within the madness?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a process of discovery, but just having the willingness to look at that there may be both sides, that there may be that even something that's disturbing and distressing may have something positive to it, or maybe when it's put in a different form, it will become something positive. Again, like the potato, which seems of no value before it's cooked, but when it's processed the right way, oh, this actually does have some value. It's a big, you know, tricky thing that you have to work out with each person.
And then Patty asks if you can recommend John Weir Perry's writing that helps with insightful views of psychosis. Do you recommend?
Yeah, let's see, which are books? My memory's not. Far Side of Madness, I remember, is one. I'm not sure that's the best. By the way, just mentioning John Weir Perry, here's a nuance. I think John Weir Perry was a great visionary, but in some ways he was also a very flawed human being, because I know a psychiatrist who spent many years treating a woman who John Weir Perry had sex with while she was a patient of his. And, you know, so that was an example of, you know, sometimes people who think of themselves as revolutionaries and on that creative edge, they go too far in some kind of way. And that was an example where he went too far with a creative. I think he was really great in bringing a lot of openness to madness, but he opened up a little too far in a certain way and created a big problem. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Maintaining humility in the midst of so many things that we think is really a challenge. Let's see. We're coming right up on the end. Ane said that an excellent book on the subject is The Stormy Search for the Self by Christina and Stanislav Grof. And let's see. Oh, sorry. I haven't been speaking loudly enough, and with apologies, next webinar. And sorry about this one. Let's see. Kimberly asks, what is the name of the study, involuntary/voluntary?
I'd like to say if people have further questions after this webinar, I'm going to be mailing out the slides. On the front of the slides, it has my email address. Well, actually, you can just respond to the email too. And just email me additional questions and I'll, seek to answer them. Because I know that you may have questions that don't get answered here and stuff like that.
I think we've, last question. Debbie McNamara asks you to address the point that she made about neoliberalism. I'm not sure that a neoliberal dismissing of positive social causative factors is also unhelpful. Does that make sense in the context?
Yeah, I mean, the whole sense of the individuals are just blamed for whatever's, gone wrong with them, where there's the fact that people are stressed by a society where the 1% are sucking everything out of it and making everybody work in terrible conditions, and then turning people against each other, like turning racial groups against each other, and and then all the abuse that often goes way back intergenerationally. Yeah, all that stuff is really what people are struggling with and trying to find some way to make sense of and move forward. And and trauma is just incredibly confusing to people, and often people going through madness or psychosis or whatever is attempting to sort through that. And sometimes as you're trying to sort through, you're actually getting more deeply lost. But then there's also a thing like sometimes you just need to become lost enough to become clear that with the direction you were going is a dead end, and that actually becomes part of actually discovering the right way. It's what William Blake made a statement that really impressed me when I was a young person. He said, "The fool who persists in his folly will become wise." And so this idea, you keep doing something foolish, but then you really see the consequences of that, and you maybe see it more clearly than someone who wasn't as foolish as you were. And folly back in the Middle Ages often meant madness.
We're at 1:30, and thank you so much to everyone. There are 95 people here at the peak. Thank you for being here, for asking the great questions. Thank you to Patrick for signing so beautifully throughout the session. And Ron, your talk was amazing, and I can't wait to listen to it while I'm walking or doing housework, as you suggested. Thank you. But Ron will close out much more effectively than I, so I'm going to turn the mic back to him.
Well, thank you, Claire, for really hanging in there with all this and going through the questions. And I really appreciate all that. And thanks to everybody that showed up. And yeah, thanks for the interpretation. I really appreciate it all.